This episode of Peppa Pig was never shown on TV and is a deleted episode of the animated series The Nightmare Dimension Night had settled over Peppa Pig's house, and everything seemed normal. The moon cast a soft glow through the window. George was quietly snoring in his little bed, and in the distance, the gentle creaking of the floorboards marked the steps of their parents. It was just another peaceful night, but when Peppa opened her eyes, everything was wrong. The room looked different. Instead of the familiar yellow wallpaper, the walls were dark and cracked. The window no longer showed green hills and a bright sun. Beyond it was only endless, thick fog, glowing faintly with an eerie red light. The air carried a strange scent, like the aftermath of rain, but mixed with something metallic. George had woken up too. His bed seemed taller and narrower, as if the walls had shifted. His toy dinosaur, which had been brand new yesterday, now looked old and covered in dust. The house was unrecognizable. The floorboards groaned too loudly, the hallway stretched longer than it should, and the paintings on the walls, paintings that had never been there before, depicted faceless figures. A heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water, though there was no water in sight. Something moved in the kitchen. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed in the darkness. A tall shadow appeared in the doorway. Its outline was familiar, resembling Daddy Pig. But something was wrong. It didn't move like Daddy. Its eyes glowed with a cold, white light, and its breath sounded like a distant wind sweeping through an empty void. The walls whispered. The voices were faint, as if they came from the house itself. They called out, offering warmth, a cozy dinner, a place to stay. But there was something deeply unsettling in their tone. Through the fog outside, another shadow flickered. It moved in unnatural, jerky motions, like a broken puppet. Something was here, watching, waiting. Peppa gripped George's hand tightly and took a step back. The world around them was changing. The walls seemed to pulse as if they were alive, and the air grew heavier. They had to run. But where? And was there even a way out of this nightmare dimension? This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig, not the real Grandpa. The day was overcast. Gray clouds hung low over the pig family's house, muting the sunlight. A strange silence filled the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind outside. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were preparing for Grandpa Pig's arrival. Peppa and George ran excitedly around the house, eagerly waiting for him. Soon there was a knock at the door. They rushed to open it. Grandpa Pig stood on the doorstep, but he looked different. His eyes were too light, his skin too pale, and his smile too stiff. He stepped inside slowly, fluidly, as if he wasn't entirely in control of his own movements. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant, hollow. Mummy Pig gave him a worried glance but said nothing. The day passed uneasily. Grandpa Pig barely ate. He just sat at the table watching Peppa and George without blinking. His movements were unnatural, sometimes too abrupt, other times too slow, as if he were adjusting to his surroundings. Night fell. The children went to bed, but Peppa couldn't sleep. A sound came from outside her room, a soft shuffling. She peeked into the hallway. Grandpa Pig stood in the darkness. He wasn't moving, just slowly tilting his head from side to side, as if listening. And then Peppa noticed something terrifying. His shadow didn't match his body. It moved differently. When he took a step forward, his shadow lagged behind before copying him a second later. Peppa's breath caught in her throat. Grandpa froze as if he had heard her, and then his face began to change. His skin tightened, his eyes darkened, and his smile stretched too wide. Bits of his flesh began to peel away, like an old mask crumbling. Underneath, there was something else. Something thin, distorted, wrong. It took a step toward her. Peppa slammed the door shut. Outside, a low, dragging scrape echoed down the hall as if something was running long, sharp fingers across the wood. Then, silence. But Peppa knew that thing was still there and wasn't leaving. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig, the Strange Guest. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family home. Peppa and George were playing in their room, while Mummy and Daddy Pig were in the kitchen preparing dinner. The wind howled outside and the rain tapped on the roof, giving the house a cozy, safe feeling. But suddenly, a strange silence settled over the house. Peppa stopped and listened. The room felt a little unsettling. She walked over to the window but saw nothing unusual. However, her gaze lingered on a small shadow near the door. The shadow was unnaturally long, as if someone had left it behind, but no one had entered the room. Peppa decided to go ask her parents, but when she approached the hallway, she noticed that the front door, which usually was tightly closed and locked, was slightly ajar, as if someone had just come inside. She looked towards the staircase. Something caught her eye. On the stairs stood an unknown figure, barely visible in the dark. At first, she thought it might be Daddy Pig, but the figure was too tall and too thin. And the figure wasn't moving. It stood completely still, staring straight at her. Peppa felt a strange unease. She backed away, but her eyes kept following the figure on the stairs. Gradually, it began to move closer, but its movements were not human. They were too smooth, as if something not quite alive. Soon, the figure was right in front of Peppa. It was completely black, with no discernible features. Only pale eyes glowed in the darkness, cold and eerie. Peppa froze, not knowing what to do, when the figure took a step forward. Peppa jumped, ran to the door, and screamed. She couldn't understand why she hadn't heard any footsteps from this entity, as it stood right in front of her. But as soon as she turned around, the figure vanished, like a shadow in the night. Mummy and Daddy Pig rushed into the hallway. Peppa tried to explain what she had seen, but when they entered, there was nothing unusual in the room or the hallway. The door was, as usual, closed, and once again, a complete silence had settled over the house. The next morning, the door was shut, and there was no sign of the strange guest. But Peppa couldn't forget its eyes. This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, The Descent into Darkness. The day started as usual. Sunlight filtered through the windows of the Pig family's house, filling the rooms with a warm glow. The scent of breakfast lingered in the air and birds chirped outside. Everything was calm. Peppa was the first to step out of the bedroom, followed by George. As always, they headed downstairs for breakfast and cartoons. Everything seemed normal. The same walls, the same rug on the stairs, the familiar sounds of Mummy and Daddy Pig somewhere below. But as they took their first steps down, something felt different. The floorboards creaked too loudly. The air thickened, heavy like the moment before a storm. The stairs felt smoother than usual, as if someone had polished them in their absence. Peppa took another step, and suddenly the floor vanished beneath her. Her body was pulled into emptiness as if the stairs had never been there. She had no time to scream, just the feeling of being yanked downward at terrifying speed. George, following closely behind, disappeared after her. They were falling. For a moment, or perhaps an eternity. There was nothing around them, no walls, no ceiling, no floor. Only an endless, consuming black void swallowing them whole. The air was cold and suffocating. It felt as if they had fallen into the darkness itself. Then, impact. A dull, heavy thud. Peppa felt something hard and cold beneath her. Her breath was ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached out with her hands, touching the ground, damp, sticky, covered in something that felt like dirt, yet softer, almost like living flesh. The darkness remained thick, impenetrable. Her eyes tried to adjust, but nothing changed. There wasn't even the faintest glimmer of light. The air was stale, heavy with the faint scent of decay. The unease in her chest grew into something worse, pure dread. Somewhere below, deep in the unseen abyss, something moved. Not the wind, not dripping water. Footsteps, slow, heavy, purposeful. They were getting closer, rolling across the unseen ground, as if something massive was walking toward them. Then, silence, a stretched, unbearable quiet. And then, something slid nearby, software careful, very close. Peppa felt it before she saw it, long, cold fingers barely brushing against her shoulder. Too thin, too rigid. They lingered for a moment as if studying her. The darkness shuddered. The ground beneath her trembled, the air filled with a deep, muffled sound like a distant rumble. Something was awakening. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was alive. And then the world beneath them collapsed again. They were falling, deeper. And now something was waiting for them.